Genre, fantasy. Essential question. How can we classify and categorize things? Read about what happens when Toad loses his button. A lost button. From Frog and Toad Are Friends by Arnold Lobel. Toad and Frog went for a long walk. They walked across a large meadow. They walked in the woods. They walked along the river. At last they went back home to Toad's house. "Oh, drat," said Toad. "Not only do my feet hurt, but I have lost one of the buttons on my jacket." "Don't worry," said Frog. "We will go back to all the places where we walked. We will soon find your button." They walked back to the large meadow. They began to look for the button in the tall grass. "Here is your button," cried Frog. "That is not my button," said Toad. "That button is black. My button was white." Toad put the black button in his pocket. A sparrow flew down. "Excuse me," said the sparrow, "did you lose a button? I found one." "That is not my button," said Toad. "That button has 2 holes. My button had 4 holes." Toad put the button with 2 holes in his pocket. They went back to the woods and looked on the dark paths. "Here is your button," said Frog. "That is not my button," cried Toad. "That button is small. My button was big." Toad put the small button in his pocket. A raccoon came out from behind a tree. "I heard that you were looking for a button," he said. "Here is one that I just found." "That is not my button," wailed Toad. "That button is square. My button was round." Toad put the square button in his pocket. Frog and Toad went back to the river. They looked for the button in the mud. "Here is your button," said Frog. "That is not my button," shouted Toad. "That button is thin. My button was thick." Toad put the thin button in his pocket. He was very angry. He jumped up and down and screamed, "The whole world is covered with buttons and not one of them is mine." Toad ran home and slammed the door. There on the floor he saw his white, 4-holed, big, round, thick button. "Oh," said Toad, "it was here all the time. What a lot of trouble I have made for Frog." Toad took all of the buttons out of his pocket. He took his sewing box down from the shelf. Toad sewed the buttons all over his jacket. The next day Toad gave his jacket to Frog. Frog thought that it was beautiful. He put it on and jumped for joy. None of the buttons fell off. Toad had sewed them on very well. Meet Arnold Lobel. Arnold Lobel was often sick and missed many days of school when he was young. When he went back to school, he made friends by telling stories and drawing pictures. Many years later, Lobel's children liked to catch frogs and toads. Lobel loved the animals and wrote about them in his Frog and Toad stories. Author's purpose. Arnold Lobel wanted to write about good friends. Write about your friend. Tell how you help each other. Respond to reading. Retell. Use your own words to retell a lost button from Frog and Toad Are Friends. Text evidence. 1. How does Toad feel when he can't find his button? How do you know? 2. How does Frog feel when Toad gives him the jacket? 3. How can you tell that a lost button is a fantasy story? Make connections. What are all the ways Toad describes his button? Genre: nonfiction. Compare texts. Read about the different ways to sort objects and animals. Sort it out. Some things are alike, some are different. We can sort things by looking at what is the same about them. We can sort them by their size, shape, and color. Find the buttons in this picture. Let's sort them. How many round buttons can you see? How many square buttons can you see? What other shapes do you see? Add up the number of red buttons. Are there more red or yellow buttons? Can you find buttons with 4 holes? How else could you sort these buttons? We can sort animals too. We can sort animals by features. Which animals have 4 legs? Which animals have 2 legs? Which have none? Which animals have patterns? Which animals have yellow? Which are bigger than you are? We can classify animals by type. Which are birds? Which are reptiles? Which are mammals? What other types of animals can you see? Sorting is a lot of fun. Let's sort things in this scene. Think about what they have in common. Which of these things have wheels? Which eat food? Which can fly? Which have stripes? Which have windows? Which would you play with? There are lots of ways to sort the things in this scene. Think of as many ways as you can. Make connections. How can we sort objects? How can we sort animals?